section. So I would like to hand over to Baroness Janet Whitaker now. Thank you.
Thank you, Orla. Good morning, everybody. I'm really delighted to welcome you to the launch of this pioneering and disturbing report on the psychological impact of hate crime on the Gypsy, Travel and Roma communities. It contains unprecedented and original survey material and significant in-depth research set against social media analysis. We can link this to earlier work on the incidence of bullying in schools and the experience, particularly of women encountering neighbourhood hostility and poor accommodation, so that we have a compelling picture of the deep harm done by the continual prejudice meted out to gypsies and travellers by hate speech and hate crime. I very much welcome the message from the Minister for Suicide Prevention, Nadine Dorries, and I think it's going to go on the website. We can now expect concerted government action to try to remedy the crisis. Now, I don't think you need to hear any more from me because you're going to hear from the real experts. I very much look forward to the speeches by the inspiring Vice-Chancellor of Buckinghamshire University, Nick Braisby, and the authors of the report, Josie Driscoll, Professor Margaret Greenfields, and Dr. Carol Rogers.
Thank you very much, Baroness. And over to you, Professor Braisby.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you, Janet, Baroness Whitaker. Thank you very much for your ongoing support, both for this research and for the event. And of course, thank you to Orla and all at Gate Herts, again, for your support of this valuable research, and of course, for hosting this event today. I just want to make a few observations, if I may. And my first actually is about the value of research and the vital role played by UK universities in generating research with real impact. Research is not the preserve of only a few universities. High quality research of national and international significance is found throughout the university sector here in the UK. And of course, I'm delighted by the current government's commitment to increase spending on research and development, and of course would encourage the government to put in place robust alternatives to the current EU funding streams within which UK universities participate, and ensure these will enable the funding of high quality research, such as that you'll hear about today, wherever it exists. And Research England will also soon be considering how to develop the UK's research excellence framework. And while we would want any revised future exercise to recognise traditional indicators of excellence, I expect articles in Nature would always be highly rated. It should also ensure that other forms of output are equally recognised for the quality of the research they contain. My second observation, if I may, is about leadership and the role of people who are fortunate enough, like myself, to occupy positions of leadership. And in that, I would include all university UK Vice-Chancellors. I've seen at first hand this year the very important work being carried out by the sector, supported, of course, by its representative bodies and by individually many Vice-Chancellors. Universities UK itself recently published a very important report into tackling racial harassment, and I was privileged to sit on that advisory group. Well, we heard from many people describing the distressing, sometimes appalling, lived experience of being on the receiving end of racial hatred and discrimination. And what I learned from that exercise was twofold: that no one should be complacent in assuming that our institutions don't allow racist attitudes and behaviours to persist, and also that change requires action. And in this particular case, words simply aren't enough. And the report goes on to exhort UK universities to make tangible, practical, real steps to ensure there is significant and lasting change. My university, Buckinghamshire University, has always stood for those who might otherwise be denied the benefits of higher education because of disadvantage, whether it be social or financial, or because of personal circumstance, or because of structural discrimination and prejudice. I think we've got a particularly proud record in developing an inclusive learning community, including reducing, for example, the BAME attainment gap and opening up access and participation to groups underrepresented in higher education, including Gypsy, Traveller, Roma, Show People and Boater communities. But I've learnt over the last year or so that I've been in my role that these communities are among the most disadvantaged in the UK. And we all have a responsibility to eradicate the racism, the prejudice and the discrimination towards them. So my last observation is more particularly about the GTR communities. I should say I'm so very personally proud of the work conducted by Professor Margaret Greenfields and Dr. Carol Rogers into the psychological effects of hate crime on Gypsy, Traveller and Roma communities. And so this brings me full square to my third observation. Their work, of course, exemplifies the need properly to fund, support and promote all excellent research. As I said, it's not always the paper in Nature that shines a light on our society and the needs of our people, nor generates real and lasting impact. Margaret's work, I think, is transformational in highlighting the need for lasting change in order to support GTR communities. And I personally have learned an awful lot from her. I think it is Margaret's work that has led the university, for example, to create, with community organisations and other partner universities, a pledge for higher education institutions. The pledge will ask universities to take practical, tangible steps to improve the experience and outcomes of GTR students in higher education and address underrepresentation. And we'll be launching the pledge at an event on the 20th of January, co-hosted by the university and Baroness Whittaker. And I'm again delighted to have Baroness Whittaker's support. But I ask you all just to look out for news of that event and join us if you are able. But today we're here to recognise the really very important findings of Margaret and Carol's excellent report. As I've begun to understand more and more of the GTR SB communities, I've come to see how important it is for all of us, for our society, to ensure that the discrimination and hatred they are often exposed to is eradicated. And just as the university will not rest in trying to create a truly inclusive learning community until all of its students and staff feel they both belong and are cherished, so too, I would argue, our society will never be inclusive as long as communities such as Gypsy, Traveller, Roma, Show People and Boater communities feel they do not belong nor are cherished. So at that point, I will close and hand over, but I hope this event will prompt us all to take the time to reflect on the value of the research we will hear about today in bringing about the goal of trying to create a truly inclusive society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And now I think it's Professor Margaret Greenfields and Dr. Carol Rogers to report on their findings.
Okay, thank you very much. And it's great. It was just wonderful to hear from Baroness Whittaker and Professor Braisby, and thank you for the kind words. Before we start to present on the findings, and they are deeply disturbing, there's just one or two people I'd like to make a point of thanking. I mean, obviously our colleagues and people we've heard from already, but I particularly want to thank all the community members who've taken part in this research. It's been challenging to work on, and I don't often say that because I've worked with Gypsy and Traveller communities for a very long time, and also people street homeless, victims of sexual violence and refugees, but this one has been particularly difficult because of some of the evidence we've heard. So very much thank the community members. I'd also like to thank MHCLG, so the Ministry for Housing, Community and Local Government, for funding this study. And some other people, we mentioned two of them, and I hope they're with us in the introduction. And these are two students through the Nuffield Foundation who had short placements with us and worked on a social media study. And they're Ladan Hussain and Hannah Ehsan, and I hope they're with us. I don't know if they are, but I'd very much like to thank them and say how important it is as well that young people from diverse communities who perhaps had no experience or knowledge of Gypsy traveller or Roma people before taking part in this were able to have a short placement at our university and work on this area of the study. And finally, I'd also like to thank Matt Rogers, who has worked heroically from our PR department over the last week or two to help us actually work on press releases and reach this stage. So I've done a sort of a bit like my Oscar speech, and it would go on if I thanked everyone. And now I'd like to start to share the findings, and Carol and I will be taking turns in presenting. Do we have screen sharing?
Yes,
authority?
Margaret, I'm just going to make you host now so you can share your screen. Okay.
Have I got that? Okay, lovely, thank you. Right, let's go. That's why I need to move from the start. Right, slideshow. Bear with me. So I'm just trying to actually get to the start of this slideshow from the start and from the beginning. There we go. Right, so this is the title of the study, Hate as Regular as Rain. And it was a particular striking image, and that came from one of the people we interviewed, and they just sort of spoke about it being something which just comes back again and again. You don't quite know when it's going to happen, like rain, but you know it is part of a lived experience. And well, should we carry on? So the background to the project: we were commissioned to undertake some research to build upon what's really significant anecdotal evidence of suicide rates. As I said, I've worked with the communities for a very long time, and I know in 2009, reporting for the Equality and Human Rights Commission, I wrote a chapter talking about suicide at that point. So it's a story that's come back again and again and again. We keep hearing about excessive suicide rates, but we haven't had any evidence to date. We know from Ireland that there are high levels of suicide amongst Gypsy and traveller community, but this is literally, you know, a unique study, gives us the first piece of solid research into the prevalence in the UK. There's earlier studies, as you can see, the Traveller Movement 2017 and Report Hate GRT last year. They have underpinning evidence talking about high levels of racism and discrimination, reports made to them of people experiencing hate speech and hate crime. And we know too, importantly, that while we haven't had the evidence base for Gypsies and travellers and Roma, and that fundamentally, there's issues around reporting you hear about later, but also very often the communities are not included in data sets, which makes it really difficult for us to actually track all sorts of things, including health outcomes. So it's quite tricky. But what we do know is some evidence from other BAME, Black and minority ethnic communities, and I don't like lumping people together in that way, but from BAME community evidence that there are detrimental mental and physical health impacts of experiencing racism. So a large-scale study 4 years ago found that even 2 significant incidents of racism or discrimination reduced the mental health and well-being amongst BAME victims by 2.35% compared to people who hadn't had such experiences. Now, one of the issues I think it's worth thinking about here is that probably many people in this room will know how often Gypsies and travellers and Roma, so particularly the ethnic groups, but also showmen and boaters to some extent, will experience high levels of hate speech. If any of you have seen today, this morning, The Guardian launched a report on it. They've actually done an article about this report being launched. The Guardian tweeted this out, and I think it was about 7:30 this morning. When I looked at about 9 o'clock, you know, one could almost not make it up. Here's a report headlined, Hate Speech Impacts Mental Health and Wellbeing. And there was sort of quite a torrent of hate speech beneath it, saying people had brought this upon themselves, it's no wonder, talking about criminality, and all of those tropes immediately being recycled that we're going to talk about again. So you can see if someone's a member of the community, this is something that is a drip feed, a constant backdrop to their experiences. And in fact, some of the work that our student placements did was they looked for us, did some research into looking at who were the most hated group on social media, because they undertook social media research. And in 2014, and I would argue it's probably got stronger, gypsies and travellers were identified as the #1 group impacted on social media for hate speech. So that's the backdrop. So what did we set out to do? It's only a pilot study. There's a lot more work to be done. And we were, I don't know, shocked, but perhaps not surprised at the findings in this pilot study. And if a larger scale project takes place, there's going to be, I'm sure, a lot more to come out. But we set out to look at this significant anecdotal evidence about the ripple effect of experiencing hate crime on mental health, suicide and parasuicide. So parasuicide is suicide attempts. And we had these following objectives. We undertook a scoping exercise to look at how often people experience hate crime or repeat incidents of hate crime across the UK. It was self-reported, but also to see, and again, this is self-report and subjective opinion, whether there's some link between hate crime, poor mental health, and incidents of suicide or suicide attempts. Josie, I see there's people waiting to get in. Sorry, I've just mentioned that. So we also wanted, and this is hugely important because we know from other research, other studies, and again, the anecdotal evidence, children talk about experiencing bullying and discrimination based on their ethnicity in school from a very, very young age. So we wanted to try and look, and this is Carol's expertise, about educational environments and the impact of hate crime on young people. So this is what we did. We carried out a literature review, and I'm going to flag this up now. We don't really talk about literature review in this presentation.
Sorry, Margaret, can I just, sorry for interrupting you. You're going to have to leave them in because I've made you host.
Oh, I'm sorry. Right, okay, bear with me. Right, in that case, I'm not entirely sure how I do it, I'm afraid.
Just, if you go to participants and at the top, just admit all.
I think I'm going to have to stop screen sharing to do that because they've disappeared. Oh dear. Right, I'm so sorry. Shall I just stop it and do it?
Is there, how many is waiting to get in?
Well, it said 3 a moment ago, but they've disappeared. I don't know what I've done to them. All right, sorry about this. No, they seem to have gone, I think. Okay, that was a little unfortunate, especially I'm going to, I don't quite know what we do on this point.
If you try and change it so that you can both be co-hosts, someone else can then add people in.
Right, thank you for that. I have no idea how to do that. So I'm really exposing here now, aren't I, my sort of lack of technical knowledge, I'm afraid.
I can't see anybody waiting anyway.
They might have come in. There were 3 people have gone. Okay, sorry, let me go back. So the literature review, we don't really talk about the literature review in this, but I think one thing I would emphasize, and when you see the report, which is quite a big report, that we've looked at some evidence from other countries, and I would strongly urge people to look at the literature pertaining to First Nation peoples in Canada and also Aboriginal populations in Australia, because there's absolutely striking similarities in relation to the outcomes, poor mental health, suicide, parasuicide, and a number of other issues between those communities and gypsies and traveller. Social media analysis, and this again is thanking our sort of placement students who did this for us. They looked at 2,000, used various metrics, and 2,000 plus items were examined to actually pick up some of the patterns. And we issued a survey which received 88 responses in the end. We had 8 separate interviews and focus groups with 19 people. We were due to go into schools and do a series of workshops with children, both Gypsy Traveller Roma children and non-Gypsy Traveller Roma, on bullying and racism. So we were going to sort of work on scenarios, and some schools had already agreed to support that piece of work, but it had to be abandoned because of COVID.
Margaret, okay. To interrupt, but you're not sharing your screen at this point.
Oh, sorry. Right. Okay, I'm so sorry. Right, let's try and get back into it. Thank you for telling me. It looks as though I am on this. Let me try it again. Right, okay. So very embarrassingly, this is because obviously of coming out of it. Let me just go back. So this is a slide I now want to speak about, is demographics. And you'll see here, if I can try and make that a little bit larger for you. We have the people who participated. We had a small number of bargees or boaters. We had a larger number of English Roman gypsies, who were 34 participants, 11 Irish travellers, 9 Roma, Scottish gypsy travellers. Now, they are typically very underrepresented in survey work. It's very difficult quite often to gain information. Has 6 participants, 2 show people, 3 Welsh gypsies. And the category of other is very interesting, because some of this was also non-GTR support workers from NGOs, because we sent the survey out to NGOs as well as to community members. But a lot of people who classified as other were of dual heritage. So, for example, we had one person who was part Roma and part traveller, and we had other people perhaps who described themselves as being, you know, half Romani gypsy and Irish, for example, but not traveller backgrounds. So they're quite diverse population. Okay.
Margaret, sorry to interrupt. Can you just go on to, because you've not got the full slide showing. You go into the current slide or back into the full slideshow. Right.
Okay. Sorry. Right. Thank you.
That's
right.
Better. Yeah.
Well, hopefully we can get into swing a bit better. That was why I came out of it. Okay. So I've done demographics, and I've now got it down as over to Carol.
Okay. Thank you. So we wanted to start with sort of looking at defining what hate crime is as well. And when we looked at this definition from the Home Office, which you can see here, I think one of the things that really struck us was that ethnic groups of gypsies and Irish travellers were specifically identified by name, so separated out from other ethnic groups. And again, feeling that that was perhaps really indicative of these significant levels of hate crime and incidents that they experienced, that they were actually specified as a specific group within the definitions. So, Margaret, can you move the slide on for me, please? Thank you. And again, we had so many responses, far too many quotes than we were sort of able to use. But go back one for me, thank you. And as Margaret said at the beginning, this one that brought us to the title, As Regular as Rain, was one that really hit home to us, but also people saying that their experiences were almost daily. And again, this one here that we picked up for the beginning of the report, about how normalised the experiences are within the communities, and how it says here so it becomes so ingrained that actually people stop hearing it and just normalise it, which again is has huge significance for our mental health and well-being. You can read that through there for yourselves, but again you can see some of the significant terminology that's in there, particularly around dehumanizing as well. Thank you. Can you move on, Margaret, please? Next slide. Thank you. So this is just a really quick overview of our key findings to share with you today. But it shows the significance of these incidents. That 78% of our survey respondents suggested that these incidents happened very often. And as we said, some of the more qualitative comments we came were that it was daily and very, very regularly. You can see there we had 18% said it happens often, and only 3% indicated that it was sometimes or perhaps less often than that was happening. The most common forms of hate speech and hate crimes that were experienced, you can see here again, were from within and across services. So 94% of the survey respondents said they'd experienced hate speech and hate crime from services such as health, education, policing, the generic services that they'd come into contact with. 89% said that was in relation to, again, reinforcing negative stereotypes. 87% social media abuses, and that's an area that significantly increased the social media abuse. And one of the other things that came out from that aspect was the differences in what historically perhaps being generically targeted at the community themselves, whereas now people were seeing individuals being targeted on social media. So again, the media incitement to racial hatred experienced by 82% of respondents. And as Margaret alluded to earlier, really very concerning is the continuation of really high intergenerational levels of bullying in schools. And the association that we have here with adverse childhood experiences. We know gypsies and travellers have very poor, poor attainment rates. And this early and ongoing sort of experience, which transfers into lifelong victimisation through these hate incidents. Next slide, please, Margaret.
It isn't happening for some reason. I've got no idea what's going on. That's it.
Okay, thank you. And that's back. Okay. So the impacts we have here then are, as you can see again, that we had 77% of our respondents provide some additional commentary for us, which obviously gives us the details of their lived experiences. And we've broken those down into these key categories of the impacts, of which see mental health, depression, anxiety, came out very, very strongly. Withdrawal. So one of the ways of managing this is to withdraw from even further from societies and communities, and the hiding identities. So the hiding of transcriptions and actually trying to hide into mainstream society as a way of learning to live with it, but not actually acknowledging gypsy and traveller ethnicity. Self-medication and harmful behaviours, huge issues and problems there, particularly around the men in the community, and as we've said, much higher incidences of suicide and parasuicide than we would see within the wider community. And again, there's a quote there that you can just read for yourselves, just to give you an idea of the type of things that we were seeing. So you can see that the frequency here on more than 10 occasions, people were moved on, were blamed. So this is very, very frequently happening. Okay, thank you, Margaret. I think that's back to there's some more examples here, and then I think we're back to Margaret. So I'll hand back to Margaret now for the next set of findings.
Okay, so we've got quite a lot to get through, so I'm going to probably try and speed up slightly. I hope those poor people who are outside manage to somehow get in, otherwise we'll just have to share this with them after. So we broke down findings by key themes. And as I sort of alluded to before, that literature already indicates that, sorry, it's just flashed up again, saying there's 4 more people in the waiting room. I have no idea what to do with them. In the literature, that gypsies and travellers are the #1 targets of online hate speech, and they account for 15% of racist or discriminatory slurs overall. So that might not sound a lot, but when you actually think of the whole sort of torrent of discourse that one sees online, 15% is, quite a large group. In part, there's this sort of widespread failure we identify with members of the public to identify or challenge hate speech or offensive language. Very interestingly, over the last 48 hours, there was a sort of Twitter storm saying, "We stand up for travellers." And although there was a lot of people perhaps who'd never sort of entered into discourse around supporting travellers, it was quite interesting to note that a number of people then commented and said, oh yes, I suppose this is the same as if we heard someone speaking in a derogatory manner about someone who's black or Jewish or Asian. So I think a lot of it we've identified seems to be this sort of gap in perception. So there is this repeated series of tropes, and as Carol said earlier, it's almost so normalised, people actually don't recognise at times when they're being grossly offensive or racist towards communities who are protected under the Equalities Act as ethnic minorities. Very typically, the social media and also sometimes online in newspaper narratives as well, GTR communities are presented as having a problematic lifestyle, and this is sort of conflated with criminality, and we'll be talking about that again later. So just to give you a quick sort of look at some of the data from Gates Hart, from their Report Racism website, and I'm sure Josie will be speaking about this later. There was 172 reports made over a period of a few months. But this website, a lot of people still aren't familiar with it. So there's obviously a lot more going on out there than is actually being reported. But what did occur was after the Dispatches programme was shown in April this year, and some of you will be familiar with it, there was quite an uptick with 45 reports made to that website. And again, bearing in mind, it's the tip of the iceberg of people who actually make reports. And there are an additional 92 cases reported through that website between February and May. Overall, however, and this is going to become deeply concerning, reporting of hate incidents remain low. So we know there's lots of evidence of what's going on online. We're picking up lots of narratives, and we actually go out and interview people, we complete surveys, but people are very loath to make a report to the police. Now, as a combination, it appears to be some of this sort of normalisation of hate incidents, linked also to a lack of trust in the police and other authorities, including schools. So we found that only 10% of survey respondents said they'd formally report hate crime or hate speech. And 77% of those responding to the survey said that this was because the experience was so common and they just felt that nothing's going to happen, essentially. This is just something we actually have to live with, and hence not almost taking those additional steps to make reports. There's clearly there's scope for work there. Again, importantly and concerningly, is depending by which ethnic group people are members of, between 38% and 35% of respondents of those categories. So they actually didn't know how to make a report of hate speech or hate crime. And in Irish travellers, PAVI people were the most likely to say they weren't aware that A, they could get any help, or that they actually knew how to make such a report. And again, we've got a quote here. We only had just a couple of people who were showmen, and we use that generically as the communities themselves do, whether someone's male or female, and we don't have a gender identified for this person. And they spoke about the fatigue from reporting and no consequences. And there's this sort of analogy which comes out in a number of interviews of this sense that police themselves are also part of wider society and hear these narratives, these tropes, and engage with people in challenging situations, so therefore perhaps may perceive of members of the community as being perpetrators rather than victims. Okay, I think, I've got another one here. So again, so it's gone backwards. Right. So this is our sort of overall findings from survey response, and we found that 27.6% said they feel ashamed, embarrassed, or uncomfortable making a report. These categories, incidentally, they mirror the categories used in other hate crime surveys for diverse populations. So in case you're thinking, well, why do we actually select those headings? This is directly taken from sort of fairly standard hate crime survey reporting. And you can see here just over a quarter, so they feel ashamed or embarrassed, but 88.5% of our survey respondents said they did not think the police authorities would do anything. So they really felt that it was just, nothing would occur. There was 26.4% concerned about reprisals, but this alarming figure, 77%, too common an occurrence to report, along with feeling it's not serious enough, and overall said this figure of don't know how to report it. And other were, sort of individual factors such as this occurred, but we moved on. For example, those sort of types of quote. Okay, I believe Carol, this is you.
No, this one's you're
Okay.
through to the education one.
Okay, right. So one of our key findings was on the impact of media. And what we discovered is that there's this very complex and often quite toxic interplay between mainstream media. So I'm sure people can think of some of the headlines that they've actually seen in newspaper reports, so whether nationals or locals, and social media. So we were able to sort of identify a cycle from the narratives we collected from people, and also just directly mapping what was going on in social media and the retweets. And quite often what happens is there might be a mainstream story, it could be a newspaper, it could be on a television program. This is picked up and amplified excessively within social media. And it would appear, at least people believe, and I think this is very accurate, is there's a sense that staff in statutory authorities and services who are inevitably exposed to these same narratives then pick up on these stereotypes. And certainly from other work that I've done over the years, we hear, for example, maybe health professionals who will ask questions of community members which reflect some of those quite derogatory narratives, such as, oh well, I suppose you're just automatically going to be leaving school at an early age, or you won't have inoculations, for example. So those sort of presumptions. So this really does seem to underpin this sense that members of the public working public services pick up this interplay between media stories. And certainly I remember when the Big Fat Gypsy Wedding programmes came out, actually talking to health professionals the week they were first shown, and people just recycled some of those tropes and said to me, you work with these communities, is it really like that? So there's general agreement also that not only is there this sort of concern about amplification of these narratives, the respondents repeatedly and clearly re-emphasise the role of the media and politicians as well, in some cases of creating spikes in hate crime and hate speech. And again, this is the issue perhaps where a political figure might make a statement and this becomes picked up within newspapers and then sort of feeds into this cycle again. So another issue which is important, I must say this hadn't occurred to us before, was how broadcast and print media might use very specific non-verbal imagery to create bias or influence. And in the report, I think we give a few examples of images that were shown, and certainly there has been challenges to Ofcom, for example, successfully won, where imagery which feeds into these stereotypes of violence or particularly gendered approaches and dirt, this thing of sort of being out of place, being dirty, being violent, involved in criminality. And it was suggested by participants repeatedly that these tropes act as a sort of visual nudge. And if you look in the report, you'll see people saying that perhaps the words are fairly innocuous in the report, but then what you've got is a big picture of rubbish. And underneath that, this then starts this feeding frenzy, more or less, of people making underlying comments. But what this does overall, there seems this intergenerational long-term impact of these negative media representations. And what it's done, it's damaging these relationships so that you have communities almost have these perceptions of gypsies and travellers always do this. This is what it equates to. And we certainly see that when you think about planning applications and the hostility towards planning applications for sites, whether privately owned or provided by the local authority. And we've also seen that evidence where community members are saying, well, it makes me feel very, very reluctant to actually engage with wider communities. So you can see the whole thing is really quite a sort of toxic mess, and there's cross-generational impacts, because we're hearing people, we've interviewed people and focus groups and say, this happened to me, this happened even to my children and my grandchild. And a sense amongst quite a few respondents is getting worse with the impact of social media. So just a few quotes, and I'm going to sort of move on fairly quickly because I'm aware we're running out of time. We've got still quite a lot to get through, but you can see here some quotes from interviews and also survey respondents. So we have here people about media showing people in negative light, and someone here talking about some individuals referring to themselves as being Romanian or Bulgarian rather than identify as actually being Roma. Okay. And this last criterion, you can see that there was 34 reports in 2 weeks after the particular Channel 4 documentary. Okay, over to Carol.
Okay, thank you. One of the most concerning things that we found from this piece of work that I don't think we expected was the significance of school bullying. You know, we knew that there was a high prevalence of that, and there's been a couple of other reports around highlighting that. But 78% of our survey respondents highlighted this as one of the most common forms of hate speech and hate crime, and continuing today. And I think, you know, very sadly, the fact that we are supposedly living within an educational philosophy of inclusion that's underpinned by the Equality Act, to have such a high percentage, again, for Gypsy and Traveller children and families still experiencing such high levels of bullying is really very concerning. We know that Gypsies and Traveller children have the lowest and poorest educational outcomes, and that's often attributed to perhaps community values towards formal education and low expectations. But actually, I think what we really need to look at much more closely is the significance of bullying within this. Where we know, again, we know a lot of children are removed from school for homeschooling as a result of discrimination and bullying. And we're not just talking about peer-on-peer bullying here. We're talking about teacher, again, discrimination and bullying, as well as a very high percentage of these experiences. Particular problems for young men and boys, again, around the vicious cycle of the traditional view of Gypsies and Travellers wanting to fight. So there's an expectation that they will want to fight, and then again the need for them to stand up for themselves, to protect themselves, protect their values, and so they're drawn into this vicious cycle of violence and perhaps disengagement in education. And we had an example shared with us of a young man who was going down the route towards criminal convictions and the criminal justice system because of his experiences within school. Alongside of this, you know, we need to consider as well the impact that these bullying experiences are starting in primary school. Again, there's a lot of publicity and a lot of evidence around what happens at secondary school level and removals then, but these are happening in primary school. So for very young children, and, you know, highlighted here as adverse childhood experiences, now we have bullying and bereavement, both of these things which have a very, very high prevalence within these communities. And in my previous research looking at bereavement experiences has highlighted this as well. This study really reinforces earlier findings around the impacts of bereavement on young children as well. And between 25 and 50% of mental health problems are established by the age of 14 years old. So if we go on to look at the indicators there of what's happening in the adult population and the mental health problems there, you know, we need to step back and we need to really be looking at what's happening with the children at a young age. If we have children that are hiding their identities to prevent themselves being bullied, you know, the ages where children's identities, personalities, sense of self and well-being are developing, we're having problems with that there. So we can start to see why we need to start looking at this in much more detail to prevent this, to give the children good experiences to support their well-being, so that actually their educational attainment will improve alongside that, the well-being as well. So, can I have the next slide, please, Margaret?
Oh, I'm clicking it, but it doesn't seem to be moving, and I have absolutely no idea why. I'm sorry. That's it. There we go.
Thank you. So again, these are just some examples of and quotes that we had from, you know, across all the survey interviews and the focus groups that we did. The top one here again is very concerning, I think, in terms of schools, that actually again racial slurs against gypsies aren't dealt with in the same way as other groups. So there's this disconnect again between the equality and the, you know, within the ethnic groups. Children here that are, you know, during the pandemic, that were pleased that they weren't at school. This again was after the dispatches programme, because they didn't have to put up with the consequences of the programme. And as the last one, as I've mentioned earlier, you know, the particular concerns around males, so they leave school early.
Sorry.
That's okay. And then this one again, which highlights the issues around identity and description, and talks about children having to grow up living two different lives, one at home and then one outside. She mentions the word schizophrenic here in terms of the severity of impact it has on personality development. Okay, thank you, Margaret. I think we're back to you now, aren't we?
Okay, and again, for some reason, it's not moving. I have no idea why. Let me try again. I'm sorry about this. Here we go. Right, I'm going to whisk through this as quickly as I can, although we're now actually almost in sort of the very core elements of this. So what are our key findings on mental health, well-being and suicide? You've had those direct quotes there, and what we can see is there's this repeated stress on this grinding, demoralizing impact of hate crime, hate speech and discriminatory representations. Just to remind you, as we made the point right at the beginning, if there are 2 or more incidents of hate crime, discrimination or hate speech, people's mental health deteriorates. But what we're seeing here is this pattern of repeated lifelong experiences. So we asked our participants if they were able to identify the most common reactions, and again, sort of Carol's alluded to this, and we've heard about mental health impacts of depression, anxiety, withdrawal from mainstream society, or learning to live with it, and self-medication. So suicide, to always bring you back to where we came in, where we started off with actually saying we want to explore suicide. And what we found was 43% of survey respondents who work for NGOs. Now, some of those people were both community members and non-community members. We've said, you know, for other populations, a working population, reported they'd had clients who had either killed themselves or attempted suicide in the last 5 years. And what they provide us with were 56 examples of service user deaths from suicide in the preceding 5 years. And you can see the table at the bottom. 3 respondents referred to having at least 10 clients who had killed themselves. Again, similar number, 3 reported 5 deaths, and you can see along the bottom. So it's multiple bereavements by suicide are being reported by service providers, which in itself is a pretty shocking figure. Okay. We also asked members of the community if they had had deaths by suicide of family members, and you can see here that we've broken this down by ethnicity, and Irish travellers, PAVI people, were most likely to report that they'd had family members who had killed themselves. Other, by the way, in that case, we've just broken down those people who are clearly related to ethnic GTR communities, so not, you know, NGO staff who are, I don't know, white British, for example. So other includes people who might have one parent who's a community member and the other who isn't. But we can see here that Irish travellers, PAVIs and other groups are most likely to have experienced bereavement by suicide, and that's 55% of all community members who responded to the survey. This is, of course, a self-selected sample, but it's still a pretty shocking figure. And these are the numbers of bereavements by suicide reported by family members. So 25 respondents reported 62 suicides in the previous 5 years. And again, you can see most people it's multiple suicides, and very shockingly, one person spoke about 18 suicides in their extended family. So this is a sort of particularly disturbing story, narrative, and this is came from an agency worker, and they spoke about what happened almost immediately after a particular program had been shown, and that a young person saw a program, it brought back various experiences, and you can see he slashed his wrists that night, just said he didn't actually want to live anymore. And the point was made that every time a program is shown, and this is something which sort of came out again quite a lot in our analysis, in the sense that some of the more, should we say, I don't know really, voyeuristic, I think is the term I'm going to use, programs about gypsies and travellers were often repeated and might come back on screen, you know, every year or so, or twice a year. And the point was made that every time that young man sees that program come up, it's going to remind him again of his suicide attempt. So just summing up very briefly in this section, we would argue our findings are adding a very highly nuanced and persuasive layer of evidence, the suggestions that not only are gypsy travellers more likely to overrepresenting figures, those taking their own lives, but also as an exacerbating factor precipitating suicide within these populations. And this is a similar finding, in fact, to evidence gathered in far more detail from Ireland, where large-scale studies have been undertaken into the impact of suicide and the interrelationship to its discrimination. Okay, recommendations. I think we're now over to Carol at this point.
Okay, thank you. So again, we've situated our recommendations under the same sort of themed headings that that we've used. So there's a few for each of those, and you can see the key ones we've got here. Most urgently, that we need to get the data sets for Gypsy Traveller and Roma groups recognised on the NHS Data Dictionary, so that we can start getting some more hard data to recognise these findings. And similarly, that the GTR communities are also included in local and national suicide prevention plans. Again here, so I'll let you read through most of these really rather than talk through them, but you can see that really we need to get engaging with authorities and national recognition of what's happening here, so that we can get rather than having this public health emergency that we have at the moment, that we have public health support and health strategies in place to provide support for reducing suicides and improving mental health and well-being across the communities. And lastly there as well, in terms of looking to work with community members to upskill and train community members who obviously are best placed to understand and support communities there. Next slide, Margaret, thank you.
So once again, I'm clicking it and it doesn't seem to be.
Nothing's happening.
I have no idea why.
It's a bit slow, doesn't it?
It does. So I hope it's not going to go too far. I'm really sorry about this. I don't know what's happening here because my computer normally can do this perfectly well. I've just frozen. There we go.
So again, similarly looking at our in terms of reporting, and as you saw earlier, as Margaret was saying, confidence in police reporting is one of the key things that needs to be increased and improved. So ensuring here that police services are engaging, monitoring how they're dealing with crimes against GTR communities, and increasing internal training and how they make their decisions around hate crime and hate speech. continuing to fund the reporting services and agencies that, so that we can increase the reporting rate, because 10%, as we said earlier, is a very, very low rate. So we need to really increase that, again, to make a real difference. And for the Ministry of Justice to review the CPS data on decision making as well, because again, although for the small percentage that are reported, there often is very little outcome, which doesn't help with the increase of reporting if communities feel nothing's going to happen, even if they do report. Next slide, please.
Oh, right, hang on, let's try it again.
If it's coming on.
That's it, it's now coming up far too fast. It's not coming fast. There we go.
Go back. Right. Need to go back one more, I think. We missed the education one.
Policing, hate crime, mental health, wellbeing.
Oh, is it after the?
No.
Yep, okay.
Public awareness.
So again, really largely increasing public awareness campaign, making the recognition that there is equity with GTR and other BAME populations, and again, sort of increasing awareness, increased backing up the prosecution, restorative justice aspects, and so that we can reduce this negative discourse as well. Okay, so whilst there's external things, there's some work to be done within communities as well. So enhancing awareness of the availability of the reporting mechanisms, the support that's available through the social change makers, NGOs and other organisations. So recognising that there is support there for individuals and families to report and be supported as well. And media representatives, politicians and community figures to be reminded of expectations of respectful discourse as well. So again, providing the same equity as they would with any other member of society. Okay. In terms of education, we need to do a lot of work there in terms of making sure that all schools are aware and recognise GTR culture. Not just, starting by having and recognising GTR History Month the same as they do Black History Month at the very minimum, but actually it needs to be much wider recognition and embedded throughout the whole of the curriculum. Recognising that GTR groups are recognised ethnic minorities, because there's a lot of schools that don't recognise that. More robust monitoring of bullying and exclusions for GTR students, and the recognition that racist bullying is happening, but it isn't just peer-on-peer bullying, that actually there's also a lot of stereotyping within from teachers as well. So there's a need to embed the same information within teacher training programs as well.
No, I think this.
And that was yours, I think, Margaret,
wasn't it? It is, I think it is.
So,
right, so we have 2 slides left, which I'm sure people will be relieved to hear, and then we can get into Q&A. So our other recommendations to do with community-facing activities. We felt there's absolutely critical need to provide additional funding to NGOs and specialist agencies to provide support and advance training and employment of community members working in partnership. So there's this very well-established model of community advocates and cultural bridges, which is highly successful. It's used throughout Europe with Roma communities, and it's been outstandingly successful where it's occurred in the UK as well. There is a need to continue this, particularly in the light of those sort of degrees of exclusion and mistrust that we've identified. Importantly, before, it's critically important to actually develop networks of solidarity between Gypsy Roma Traveller and other BAME and anti-racist organisations. This has been very notable, I think, as I said, in the last few days, where there was this sort of Twitter storm around supporting and standing up for travellers. And what we saw were there were other NGOs and community members from diverse backgrounds who were supporting travellers. And I'm sure Josie will have things to say about the work of the networks that she's very much involved with, but it's actually getting people to recognise that hate speech against Gypsies, Travellers and Roma, use of stereotypes, it should be just as unacceptable as speaking in that sort of manner about people who are Black or Asian or Jewish or other populations. Certainly in my teaching, unfortunately the website no longer exists. One of the most successful tools I ever used was a website being set up by Jewish activists called Jewify This, and what it did was you'd click on headlines of newspapers which spoke about gypsies and travellers, and it changed the term to Jew. And I think people were often quite shocked when it said things like, there's too many Jews in this area, let's get these Jews out of here, these Jews are dirty. And I think if one was to substitute the word Black or Asian for that, people would actually stop back in shock. But as we said repeatedly, there's this sort of normalisation of this terminology about gypsies and travellers. So important to develop networks of solidarity and this sort of enhanced emphasis in the work of GTR community groups themselves about shared exclusions. And we come back to that point I've made before about this really very striking similarities between outcomes and also the literature in issues such as speech used against people's stereotypes, poor educational attainment, short life expectancy, etc., for Aboriginal and First Nation and other Black communities. So hence linking up with suggesting organisations such as Black Lives Matters or similar anti-racist organisations to enhance discourse and awareness. That's our references. I think at this point I can thankfully hand back the screen sharing, and I must apologise profusely to everyone. It's extremely embarrassed at the fact that I seem to have made a complete and utter hash of the sharing. So at that point, I think we're probably open to questions if anyone's going. Oh, Josie, I believe, is probably next, is it? Or do we have questions now?
Josie, did you want to address everyone before the questions and answers? Or would you? You're on mute.
Yeah, sorry about that. No, I think just go ahead, and if there's any question and answers, we can take them now.
Okay. Over to you all.
Has anybody any questions they want to ask Margaret or Carol? So you want to just put your hand up, or David, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Josie. No, that was really interesting. And speaking from a traveller perspective, a lot of it isn't, completely new information, but seeing it in statistics is still really shocking. And I think that's that, I'm really, really grateful to the both of you for actually putting that together. And it's a tool not only for activists and community members to use, but I think seeing it in black and white really brings people's attention to it, and it's so much more than many other things could. The main question that I have, and it's following on from some of the comments that have been made in the chat as well, and conversations I've had recently with the police. And whilst, I think the recommendations are fantastic, so they're broad ranging with lots of different partners and stakeholders. One of the key issues that myself and others in the community have when it comes to reporting racism and hate crime, and indeed getting any action from, is that there isn't a robust system of reporting. There isn't a robust system which to do that. So to give one example, recently I was involved in reporting a sign that explicitly banned travellers from using a garage in Perth. Now, of course, I reported that to the police. I reported it to the HRC as well. I'm not sure if anyone from the HRC is here. A lot of pushback. I was campaigning for over a month and working with people that I knew in the police to try and get some degree of change. And in the end, nothing happened. So even where you do have, I'm quite experienced, I know a lot in the police, I know who to go to directly, where other community members may not. Even where that is the case, there's still quite a lot of pushback. I suppose my question is twofold. One of them, did your research show that there was a robust process for that? How would you recommend for that to be improved? And the second part, I'm aware that there are some people from the police here as well, but what would your direct recommendation be to community members and the police for better engagement based on your research?
Okay, I mean, I could start to answer that, but I also think that Josie, in fact, is probably a very key person to answer this, unless Carol wants to come in. So in terms of what you've just said, reporting, knowing the system and still feeling you're not getting very far, unfortunately, that was a response that we received from a number of people who actually had made reports. And we saw, I think, today that Manchester Police Service, there were reports about, this is right across the board for all sorts of communities, cases just sort of not really proceeding. So I think, that there is perhaps a broader issue, but for travellers as well, there's this particular issue of stereotyping, as we've heard. Now, I mean, obviously, I'm not in the business of sitting here saying police forces are doing things badly, because there's I hope GRTPI are here, Gypsy Roma Traveller Police Association are here, who can comment on. But I think that there is an issue in terms of actually collaboratively working together. So it's very much linking up NGOs with police forces. And of course, until we can actually do that, there's not going to be that build up of trust. In terms of reporting, I'm going to hand you over to Josie and ask her to come in, if that's all right, please.
Yeah, okay. So David, your answer to the first part of your question is, if you go back to 2016, we had nobody reporting. There was no gypsies and travellers reporting. True Vision was out there, but there was hardly any gypsies and travellers reporting on there. In the first year, I think we had 60 reports. And this year we had up to 500 reports. So we can see that this is working, but people need to get behind it and need to start reporting. That's the only way we can. If they're not reported, there's nothing going to be done about them. Now, I leave it. I think we have Mick Comby here from CPS. Are you here, Mick?
Mick still... Just unmuting and camera on again. Yeah.
So what happens with the reports when they go to True Vision? We report everything into True Vision, and after that, it's out of our hands what happens with the reports. So I'm going to pass you over to Mick to tell you. He'll tell you a bit about what happens after the reports go through to True Vision. Is that okay, Mick?
Yeah, that's fine, Josie. Thanks. The report, obviously, anything goes into True Vision is in effect reporting to the police. The True Vision team will take a look at the file and essentially identify the force area that's appropriate, because it's a national service. But it's then into the system of the police to investigate, to look at the complaint and to investigate. We're, as the CPS, we're obviously dependent on those cases, those files coming to us from the police once they've undertaken that investigation and decided there needs to be a charge. We've got one significant barrier at the moment is, as has been highlighted in the report, is that there's no specific monitoring of GRT. The flagging we have on our system is race, which covers everything in exactly the same way as the other hate crime strands of religion, sexual orientation, transgender and disability. There's no breaking down of that information. However, in the absence of that, what we've done internally is agreed that any case that comes through to us that has an element of Gypsy Roma Traveller hate crime, then that will be flagged to us centrally. So areas will report into to myself and a colleague in the central team, so we can keep an eye on that case. At the same time, we've made contact with Josie and other Gypsy Roma Traveller reporting centres to say, look, if you've reported a complaint to the police and the police tell you that it's been passed on to the CPS for prosecution, let us know, and then we'll follow that through. We'll keep tabs with that case to make sure that it's being handled properly, and hopefully we'll get a positive outcome. Difficulty is getting to that stage. We don't have many cases coming through to us. As Josie said, there's more reporting, which is fantastic, and we do need that to continue and to grow. But I think the main problem is that at the moment the investigations are not providing any cases that the police want to send through to us for charging. Once that happens, I'm sure we had literally had a couple of cases last year. One was prosecuted successfully, and one was taken to prosecution, but the judge at the end of the day decided he was going to throw it out. So it's not. These are not significant numbers, particularly when you look at the experience of hate crime and hostility that's been described today. So by no means, any satisfaction from our part. But I think there's, as Josie's touched on, there needs to be more of a flow of these cases coming through, both in the initial stage in terms of reporting, then the investigation, and then to us for prosecution. It may be early days. I'd really sincerely hope that we would see this number of reports increasing as we go forward. And myself and the CPS are absolutely committed to doing what we can to talk to communities to encourage this reporting, so we can start to see some more successful prosecutions, which in turn then will encourage people to report.
That's lovely. Thanks very much, Mick, for that. Orla.
I also say, because sometimes when it does go to court and the fines aren't very big and it just increases the antagonism between communities, we are trying to go down the restorative justice route in a lot of cases, in which case, in an effort to change hearts and minds, when I asked the police officer who supported the last restorative justice case we did, it doesn't go to CPS if it's a low-level offence, so that wouldn't even get as far as you. Yeah. But the restorative justice, we think, and I think I speak for Ivy Manning, who's here too, who's the hate crime caseworker in Brighton, that there are better results through this, because the harmer is listening to the harm that he or she has caused, and hopefully that's a better outcome.
Absolutely, all I'd say it definitely has its place. It definitely has its role, restorative justice, and I'd say that across the board for all communities. Apart from anything else, supporting a prosecution through to conclusion is really, it takes a lot out of a victim. The support in the case is not an easy thing, but it swings and roundabouts. You look at the level of the offending, the seriousness of the offence, and you'd say, yeah, there are definitely occasions where you'd want, and the CPS would be very keen to prosecute the more serious crime, obviously, to conclusion. But I think for should we say lower level offending, I don't want to take away the impact of any offending, but the offending that can be dealt with through restorative channels, I think is a very useful channel to explore.
Thank you.
There's a few questions in the chat. Sorry.
I've been trying to run down one or two of those, and I think it's people speaking about collaborative. Again,
I've got one here, Margaret.
Yeah.
This is from Hemmond Ministry. He's from Hertfordshire Equality Council, and the question is, how will this report change the minds of local politicians who, in every press I have read, is against GRT?
Oh, that's a big question. Shall I have a first go and then see if anyone else would like to come in that? I think the fact that for the first time there is hard data. I mean, clearly, as we said, it's a pilot project, but I think it's pretty hard hitting. And I saw Davey had commented earlier of actually, although in a sense it isn't new, seeing those figures, I think it's hard hitting. I think it's very, very important as well that the Minister has written a foreword. I think also we have the Minister for Suicide has written the supportive letter, as Janet presented. So what we have got now is MHCLG have supported this study, for which we're very, very grateful. And we have high level awareness. I think that's got to start sending the right message. The fact I don't know exactly who's here, but I mean, I can see that there's some very good comments here from police officers as well as CPS. So I think it's a case of people are beginning to get on board. And I don't know, I mean, Janet might well want to come back on this for yourself, Josie, but the sense that it's almost, it feels like we're beginning slowly to push against an open door instead of people thinking that we're these strange people trying to defend these other people who behave badly. I mean, if I can put it like that.
Janet, do you want to come in? You're on mute.
Yes. No, I'm going to bide my time. There are some really very, very interesting aspects here, and I want to mull over them a bit. But thank you.
So Margaret, we have another question here from Adrian Woodhead, and it's, what would the GRT community wish to say to the police as critical friends to improve outcomes and service access for the future?
I don't think that's for me to say, really, as I'm not a community member.
Yeah, I think that's, is there any Gypsy Roma traveller? Isaac, you want to answer? Anybody here from the community that wants to answer this question? Tina?
And obviously we have findings which will give, you know, there are findings and you read the report, draw a lot, but please, someone else.
Well, firstly, I'd like to say to the police that to engage with our community, you can't be friend and foe at the same time. We have people in some of the, let's say, units in local authorities that are at one stage they're trying to be landlords to Gypsy Roma travellers on sites, and on the other hand they're involved in evictions and that kind of thing you can't do at the same time. I know there's a lot of historical mistrust between Gypsy Roma travellers and the police. And I myself have experienced this when we used to go traveling. I've settled down now. I'm still a traveler, but I'm in a house. When we used to go traveling years ago, you'd get knocks on the doors at 5, 6 o'clock in the morning, and you'd have these bright lights shining in through your windows. Now, children remember this kind of thing, and they keep it in mind. And look, we're adults now, we've moved on, and we're willing to engage with the police, and but you can't be a friend and a foe at the same time. You either need to do one or the other.
Yeah, I make it right there, Josie. Until
regarding the police, we recently did a report in Wales, the COVID-19. It was funded by Moving for Change, and part of the actual project was we had community members conducting the interviews, and Dr. Adrian Marsh actually wrote the actual report. We reached out to the local authorities. Every local authority came back, and we actually reached out to the police to see if they'd like to engage in the exercise, and they did not engage in the exercise, which is actually quite sad, you know, because they usually come to all our cultural events, but then when we wanted to work with them, the answer is basically no. And you know, it does make you wonder sometimes. I know we were invited to do a communications comms review for South Wales Police, and it was clear that there was anti-Gypsyism within the communications and comms team at South Wales Police, and that was actually quite upsetting to actually read this. There's the people that had biased opinions of Gypsies and travellers, and we actually read we read the anti-gypsyism, within the communications, and I do think the police have a huge amount of work to do. Often or not, the police come onto sites extremely heavy-handed. I've actually witnessed police come onto gypsy travel sites with guns like this big, like that you would see on an airport. The police's relationship with the community is actually appalling, and it's difficult for myself because I work as traffic director, so I have to make sure that I can't be political. I've got to work with every agency that come in, but often or not, the police are just coming to us to take. But there's never an exchange. There's never an open conversation. It's like, what can you do for us? And then when we go as a community, okay, we're doing this piece of research. Would you like to engage? The answer is no. So I do think the police have a huge amount of work to do. Thank you.
Can I just? Oh, I know community members definitely go first, but something at some point I wouldn't mind dropping in if possible as well, unless the community member wants to go before me.
Anybody else? Tina, Claire.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Josephine, earlier about historical memories from the police. I remember when I was a child being pulled on my bed 6 o'clock in the morning while they were raiding us, and they never give any explanation what we're looking for or anything. But I remember we're in North London, and all my life, even as a child, if I was lost or scared, I would never go to a policeman because of this. Obviously, when I hit my early 20s, then I realised that we do need the police. And but it was the respect you give is respect you get. Really, when I grew up, policemen were bad people, and they didn't like travellers, and we always feared them. My family always feared them because I remember people saying that family members went to prison for things they never done, and if they got pulled over in a car, they were kept longer on the side of the road. Then I actually became a police liaison officer about 7-8 years ago, and I went to meetings, and I myself was addressed as, well, I was a PA to a sergeant, but one of the other police officers addressed me as a pikey assistant, and he said that's what the PA stood for. And I was in the Met Police, so it is still happening everywhere. Obviously, you get good and bad in everybody, but I've heard my children now to go to police, and if they obviously get lost or if they find themselves in a dangerous situation, go to a policeman. But when I was their age, a policeman was the person I was scared of most because of me, obviously, my experiences as a child.
And I'd just like to sort of say that, the police need to also remember that gypsy and travellers are victims of crime. We're a microcosm of every other society. If you have an unauthorised encampment that turns up, they're victims of crime before they've even unhooked their caravans. They're victims of hate crime on social media. They're victims of discrimination, of being barred from the local shops, the local pubs, before they've even made a cup of tea. So, when police officers turn up to unauthorised encampments, maybe it isn't just that they turn up and they say, you shouldn't be here, let's do a welfare check. It's also, are you a victim? Is there anything we can help you with? Is it, has anything happened where you were before? Is there anything happening here? I'd also like to reiterate something that Tina said regarding the police. I also had a meeting with inspectors of Hertfordshire Police. When I left that meeting, the next day we had a conference, our last hate crime conference, to which the late Chief Inspector Joe McDonald turned up, and he informed me that one of the inspectors had been reprimanded after that meeting. When I left, he said to him, "You were very quiet," and the inspector is reported to have said, "Yes, there's only one thing more dangerous than a pikey, and that's an educated pikey." So yeah, we also experienced, and I'd gone in a professional standing, I'd given a really good interview, a really good meeting, I'd spoke to them about hate crime and my education, and that was what they took out, that I was an educated pikey. So yeah, that's just how it rolls for us, I'm afraid.
Margaret, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you. And it's obviously far more powerful hearing from community members. I'm vaguely trying to keep up with the chat, and there's lots going on in it. But there's some very interesting points. And forgive me for not replying to all of them. But there's a point someone has just made. Sorry, so much has just popped in the last few seconds, talking about a survey of police officers and how they often, the findings from that survey actually reflected some of our own perceptions that police officers do. Here we are, it's from Amanda.
Yes, that was me. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, and it'd be interesting perhaps to hear from you on that after. But I mean, one of the points that I'd say is at our university, for example, we offer apprenticeship in policing because we've got, I mean, you know, in a sense, this pledge where we're saying GTR community members are embedded within curricula. So it's part of the decolonisation of curricular work and inclusiveness. And we've been doing this for years and years with health and social work practitioners. But it becomes a scope to actually work with universities as well, more generally. And again, I suppose I'm plugging that pledge for universities delivering professional courses to sign up to some of these good practice recommendations that say communities are included, communities are involved in training, because those people who go through and train as police officers, as social workers, as health practitioners, those public facing services are in contact with communities, and getting to know more about them, learn in an effective manner, is going to dilute some of these toxic stereotypes.
I'd just like to say that over the last couple of years, we have been engaging with our local police here in Hertfordshire, and we've actually trained up to 300 police. That's from all over the ranges, from new people coming in to chief inspectors. And I found that during the training, the younger people, the chief inspectors and the sergeants kind of had a better understanding. The younger people coming in didn't have a clue about Gypsy and Travellers or their culture. Or I think they have 3 weeks training, and there's about 2 sentences about Gypsies and Travellers in their training, if there's any. So for me, I think more training to police forces. And from our own perspective, yes, we have those memories of years ago and of police treating us badly, but we also have to, we don't look at ourselves as victims. I think that's half the problem, because we're never put down as the victim of anything. It's always, oh, if the police come, we're always coming to arrest somebody or to move somebody on, and we never think of ourselves as the victims. So I think we've got to open our own minds as well and realize that the police are there for everybody. They work for us. So we need to contact them and use them when we need them. Is there any other questions?
There's one just come in about access to resources as well. And I would also say to people, looking in the chat, there's lots of fabulous resources that people have been posting. There's a question here about hate crime and printable resources and where those can be accessed. So I guess that's probably your cue to talk about other things. And I'd also like to encourage people, please, to ask questions about education to Carol, who's our resident expert on the education situation.
So any recommendations as to the best places to access printable resources? There's a lot of stuff online now out there. We have, and there's a lot of Gypsy Roman Traveller organizations that I'm sure that can, who is that from? Foster, Carla A. Foster, who can help you or support you with any resources you need. We certainly have a lot of resources on our website. I know the Travellers Movement, FFT, London Gypsies and Travellers, Romany Arts. There's loads of Gypsy and Traveller organizations out there. We have one in Peckham, which is STAG. Get in touch with them. They're all online, they all have websites, and they can support you with resources, any resources you need. Anybody else before we close?
Josie, could I don't know if there's any education questions for Carol, but otherwise I'm wondering if we could, that might come in the box, someone might put their hand up. Otherwise, could we ask you to talk about the work you're doing with the network of people? And I know, you know, many people in this call from agencies are at the moment, the fabulous work linking up other BAME organisations around hate speech.
Yeah, so I've just gone away for Orla to introduce me, but I'll go.
Sorry.
So this project, Report Racism GRT, we hosted at Gate Herts, and we set it up in 2016. because we realized that there was no mechanism out there or nowhere for Gypsy Roma travellers to report. People were speaking about how hate crime was on the rise after Brexit, and we had no facts and figures, so we decided that we needed somewhere that gypsies and travellers could report hate crime. Now, a few of them were reporting to their local police stations, and a few of them were reporting to True Vision, but there wasn't enough people reporting, and we wanted to raise awareness of report racism and how people could report on there. Since that, we have many people sending us in hate crime incidents or hate crimes against them on a daily basis. They're sending them into our caseworkers. We have 2 caseworkers now, one based in Hertfordshire, which is Orla, who's with us today, and one based in Brighton. Ivy, are you here, Ivy? I think you are here. Is Ivy still here?
I'm here, Josie.
Yeah. Ivy, do you want to say a little bit about your work and what you do down in Brighton? And then I'll come back and tell you about the Social Change Makers programme.
Yeah, sure. Well, my work is similar role to Orla's, so a caseworker, but predominantly I'm social media. So I hunt for social media or get alerts, or people may send them into FFT via our Facebook pages or Twitter. And it's just report through True Vision or individual police forces, and just keep nagging to try and get an outcome and get some figures. I have done restorative justice with Orla early in the summer. And currently I have got 3 cases with 3 individuals that's reached out, which was going to be a very challenging day tomorrow. But just keep reporting, and if you don't get the response that you want, then take it up to a higher level, attend all GTAG meetings, the Gypsy Traveller Advisory Board, get in touch with your local police hate crime lead and just see if you can make a connection. And that's what I've been doing, and hopefully I've been getting some small wins. But you know, there is good and bad in all the police forces and all the hate crime leads, but sometimes, you know, they're not understanding that it may be an hate incident, and you just have to give them the Equalities Act to just explain and have a conversation. And normally with that, they will come back with some response.
Lovely, thanks very much, Ivy. I want to talk about our Social Change Makers programme. This is a programme made up of 15 Gypsy Roma traveller women, and they all volunteer. They do it off their own backs. So they're based around the country, and they've had training on how to take hate crime reports, and they're going to be having some training, CPS, hopefully shortly. And they help and support people in their local areas, because we couldn't possibly cover everywhere. They help them to raise awareness about hate crime, and they help them to report and any victim support that they need. They'll help them with that. So this is a fantastic program, and thank you to everybody who's on there and who's given up their time to help and support with Report Racism GRT. Today I also want to thank the people that came forward to contribute to this report, because without them this report would never have happened. And it wasn't an easy journey, to be honest with you. It was painful at times. But people came forward, and sometimes personal, very personal stuff in their lives they spoke about. I want to thank them for their bravery for doing that. I also want to thank Buckinghamshire New University, especially Margaret, Greenfields and Carl. They were certainly the right people for this report. Nobody else could have done it. And that was because of their skill and their commitment to it and their sensitivity around it. Margaret has a good relationship with Gypsy Roma travellers. She's been around, and Carol. I know Carol has done a lot of work with Gypsy Roma travellers, especially around bereavement. And I know you've done a project some years ago with the young gypsies and travellers around bereavement.
That's right.
And thanks very much, Margaret and Carol. I'd also like to thank Baroness Whitaker, who's supported us all the way with this report. Sometimes when we couldn't get through doors, she got through them for us. I'll just leave it there at that. I'd also like to thank MHCLG, because without their investment, this report would never have happened. And hopefully we can continue to work on the interventions and the outcomes to get outcomes for these recommendations. Thanks to everybody for coming today. It's a really important piece of work, and the report will be out. It's out online today. It's on Bucks University website, and we'll put it out on social media platforms after this launch. So thank you to everybody who spoke today. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Orla, for hosting. You've done a great job. And if anybody has any questions for any of us, Margaret, for us, please get in touch. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming. Margaret, do you want to say anything before we go?
Yeah, I mean, I was literally just typing in the box to encourage people to tweet out about the report, to get people talking about it and to take on board the issues. And just again to thank people. Again, I don't know if Carol's got anything she'd like to say, as obviously fundamentally part of the team.
No, I think just to echo what both you said, and particularly what Josie said about thanking everybody that took part for us, because they were very, very difficult, you know, sort of experiences to share. So, you know, huge thank you for that, because the report wouldn't have happened without those people. So, so no, that's it really, I think.
Yeah, and again, MHCLG for funding it. Without the money,
absolutely,
you know, and the encouragement, and
yeah,
and it's and just let's go out and make use of it, please, everybody. That's what it's written for.
Well, thank you, everybody. Anybody got any other questions or anything they want to say?
Me, Josie, I'd just like to say I'm one of the social change makers for the southeast of London. But I had a lady who pulled into the area in a campsite from Kent a few days ago, who rang me early this morning, who has a wedding to attend, and asked me if I know of a hairdressers in the area that would serve travellers. And this was new one to me, hairdressers. I didn't know anything. So obviously I recommended her to my hairdresser, but she was delighted and said that it's so hard to get a hairdresser that will serve travellers in Kent. And I'd just like everybody here as well like to say thank you for all coming. But can we all say congratulations to Josie today, who would have been 40 years married.
And if I can say it, I think there's going to be a new family member very, very, very soon.
Well done, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Well done.